Today, when we think of the richest people in history, names like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, or Bill Gates immediately come to mind. Their fortunes are measured in the hundreds of billions, staggering sums that shape industries, politics, even the future of space exploration. But what if I told you that even at their peak, their wealth pales in comparison to a man who lived 700 years ago? A man so rich that he could change the economy of entire nations with a single journey. And yet, his name is rarely spoken today. This isn't a story about Silicon Valley or Wall Street. This is the story of Africa, a story buried beneath centuries of silence, erased from school books, and overshadowed by the myths of European empires. But once, in the heart of West Africa, there ruled a king whose fortune was beyond imagination. His name was Mansa Musa, and he was, quite possibly, the richest man who ever lived. Mansa Musa ruled the Mali Empire at its golden age, a realm stretching across thousands of miles, rich in gold, salt, and knowledge. His story is not just about wealth. It is about power, religion, ambition, and the fleeting nature of legacy. He turned deserts into highways of commerce. He transformed cities into centers of learning that rivaled Baghdad and Cairo. And yet, his story was nearly lost to history, hidden in crumbling manuscripts and half-forgotten tales. This is the untold story of Mansa Musa, the African king whose fortune shook the medieval world, but whose legacy was silenced in the centuries that followed. But how did Mansa Musa rise to such unimaginable wealth? What made his empire the envy of the medieval world? And why, despite his extraordinary legacy, has history tried to forget him? To answer these questions, we must journey back in time to the golden sands of West Africa. To understand Mansa Musa's wealth, we must first understand the world that shaped him. Long before his rise to power, West Africa was already a crossroads of civilizations. Here, at the edge of the Sahara, rivers carried life, deserts hid treasure, and caravans stretched farther than the eye could see. This was the stage upon which an empire was born, the Mali Empire. In the 13th century, West Africa was not an isolated backwater. It was one of the beating hearts of global trade. Gold from its rivers and mines flowed north across the Sahara. Salt, essential for preserving life itself, flowed south in exchange. Ivory, cola nuts, and slaves moved along these routes, connecting the forests of Africa with the markets of North Africa and the Middle East. At the center of this world was the Mali Empire. It stretched from the Atlantic coast deep into the desert, covering lands richer than any in Europe at the time. Its foundation was built on wealth, but also on knowledge and faith. It inherited the legacy of Ghana, an older kingdom that first controlled the gold trade and expanded it into something far greater. The rulers who came before Musa laid the groundwork. Sunjata Keita, the legendary founder of Mali, united the Mande people and forged an empire that brought stability to the region. He established laws, governance, and a system of tribute that allowed wealth to pour into Mali's heartland. After Sunjata, other kings expanded the empire, pushing its borders farther and farther, securing trade routes that connected Africa to the wider world. By the time Musa was born, Mali was already rich. But Musa would not be content with simply inheriting wealth. He would transform it into something so extraordinary that his name traveled across oceans. Empires rise not only from riches, but from ideas. Mali was more than a trading hub. It was a cultural beacon. Islam had taken root, blending with local traditions. Scholars came to study, merchants came to trade, and pilgrims came to pass through on their way to Mecca. It was this fusion of wealth, faith, and learning that made Mali unlike anything Europe had seen. And into this world of prosperity and promise, Musa stepped, a prince destined to carry the weight of gold and the dreams of a continent. The seeds of greatness had been planted. Mali was ready for a ruler who could take its wealth and turn it into legend. That ruler would be Mansa Musa. But before his story begins, the world would first have to reckon with the scale of his ambition. He was not born to be a king. His rise to power came not through the orderly passing of a crown, but through a twist of fate. Musa Keita, known to history as Mansa Musa, stepped into the throne during one of the most unusual transitions in African history. Around the year 1312, the ruler of Mali, Abu Bakr II, made a bold and almost unbelievable decision. Obsessed with the mysteries of the Atlantic Ocean, he gathered a fleet of hundreds of ships. His mission? To sail west, beyond the horizon, in search of lands no one had seen before. Musa, at that time a deputy ruler, was appointed to govern in his absence. But Abu Bakr never returned. His ships vanished into legend, leaving Musa to inherit one of the wealthiest empires on earth. From the beginning, Musa saw himself not just as a ruler, but as a custodian of faith, culture, and prosperity. A devout Muslim, he pledged to strengthen the religious foundations of Mali, while also ensuring that its wealth served the empire's growth. He was described by Arab chroniclers as generous, pious, and determined. Yet behind this piety was a man of vision, someone who understood that wealth alone did not make an empire powerful. It was how that wealth was used. Musa invested heavily in his empire. He organized taxation systems to stabilize trade, improved governance across provinces, and strengthened military defenses along trade routes. Mali's caravans became legendary, carrying not just goods, but ideas, stories, and faith across the Sahara. But Musa's vision went further. He dreamed of transforming Mali from a wealthy kingdom into a cultural and spiritual beacon of the Islamic world. And soon, his faith would take him on a journey so monumental that it would rewrite his place in history. In 1312, a young man inherited an empire of gold. Within just over a decade, he would carry that gold across deserts, seas, and kingdoms, leaving the world in awe. His pilgrimage to Mecca would become the most extravagant display of wealth the medieval world had ever seen. And it would be this journey that immortalized him as the richest man who ever lived. In the year 1324, the world witnessed something extraordinary. Across the burning sands of the Sahara, a caravan unlike any other in history began its journey. At its head was Mansa Musa, king of Mali. His destination was Mecca, the holiest city of Islam. But this was no ordinary pilgrimage. It was a procession so vast, so dazzling in its display of gold and wealth, that it would echo through the centuries. Chroniclers tell us that Musa's caravan included over 60,000 people. Among them were soldiers, servants, musicians, scholars, and officials. More than 12,000 slaves, each carrying a bar of pure gold. Hundreds of camels, each loaded with up to 300 pounds of gold dust. No king in medieval Europe had ever displayed such wealth. For many who saw it, it was as if a golden tide had swept across the desert. When Musa reached Cairo, the city could hardly believe what it was witnessing. The streets were filled with spectators. Everywhere the king went, he gave away gold. He distributed so much of it to the poor, to merchants, to rulers and officials, that he accidentally triggered an economic crisis. The value of gold in Egypt plummeted. Inflation soared. Prices rose, and the economy struggled for more than a decade, all because of one man's generosity. Arab historians marveled at him. Travelers wrote down stories of his splendor. Word of his pilgrimage spread like wildfire across Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Musa had turned a religious duty into the greatest public relations campaign the world had ever seen. His wealth was no longer a rumor. It was undeniable, unforgettable, and impossible to ignore. When Musa returned from his pilgrimage, he was not just a king. He was a legend. Mali had become known across continents. Its wealth was immortalized in maps, manuscripts, and myths. But Musa's journey was not only about gold. Along the way, he brought back architects, scholars, and teachers. His pilgrimage was the spark that would turn Timbuktu into one of the great centers of learning in the medieval world. The world then knew his name. Musa's pilgrimage reshaped economies, inspired maps, and elevated Mali to global fame. But his greatest legacy was not in the gold he gave away. It was in the empire he built upon his return, an empire of knowledge, faith, and power. The story of Mansa Musa was only beginning. News of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage spread far beyond the deserts of Africa. Words carried by merchants, travelers, and scholars painted a picture of a king whose wealth seemed limitless. For many outside Africa, it was the first time they had heard of Mali, and what they heard left them in awe. Arab historians like Al-Amari documented Musa's generosity in Cairo, describing how he flooded the city with gold. These accounts traveled quickly, inspiring European mapmakers and chroniclers. In 1375, just decades after his journey, the Catalan Atlas, one of the most famous medieval maps of the world, depicted Musa as a black king, seated on a golden throne, holding a nugget of gold in his hand. For Europeans, this image was electrifying. Africa was not simply a land of mystery. It was a land of kings and riches beyond imagination. For centuries, Africa had been marginalized in the eyes of Europe, treated as a distant frontier. Musa's story changed that. Suddenly, Africa entered the imagination of explorers, traders, and conquerors. The wealth of Mali became a symbol of untapped riches waiting to be discovered. The seeds of curiosity, and later, conquest, were planted. But it was not only Musa's gold that captured attention. It was what he built with it. Musa invited architects and scholars back to Mali. Among them was the famous Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, who helped design mosques and palaces that gave Timbuktu its legendary skyline. In time, Timbuktu became a city whispered about across continents, a place of libraries, learning, and prosperity, rivaling the great centers of Baghdad and Cairo. Mansa Musa had done something no African ruler before him had achieved. He placed Mali firmly on the global stage. His wealth shaped economies, his generosity inspired chronicles, and his cities became symbols of knowledge and culture. To the wider world, he was no longer just a king. He was a legend. Yet legends are fragile. And as quickly as his fame rose, history would begin to erase his name. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage made him immortal in the imagination of the medieval world. But centuries later, his empire would fall, and his name would slip into silence. The question is, how could the richest man in history simply be forgotten? Mansa Musa's empire reached its golden peak during his lifetime. But like all empires, Mali's greatness was not eternal. After Musa's death, cracks began to show. Internal rivalries weakened the state. Trade routes shifted, and new powers rose to challenge Mali's dominance. Slowly, the empire that had once dazzled the world began to fade into history. By the 15th century, Mali was no longer the superpower it had been. The Songhai Empire rose in its place, dominating trade and learning in West Africa. Timbuktu remained a jewel of scholarship, but the memory of Musa himself began to dim. His name lingered in manuscripts, yet his story was no longer told with the same awe. Time had begun its work of erasure. Centuries later, as Europe carved up Africa during the colonial era, Musa's story was pushed further into obscurity. Colonial historians dismissed African achievements, painting the continent as a place of poverty and primitivism. Empires like Mali were barely mentioned in European textbooks. And so, the story of the richest man in history, an African king, was left untold. Yet Musa's name was never completely lost. His story survived in the manuscripts of Arab scholars, in the libraries of Timbuktu, and in the oral traditions of West Africa. In the 20th century, as historians began to challenge colonial narratives, Musa re-emerged. The world rediscovered the African king who had once shaken the medieval world with his gold. But his erasure was not accidental. It was part of a broader pattern, the silencing of African stories that did not fit the colonial imagination. The story of Mansa Musa reminds us how fragile history can be. Wealth can build empires. Gold can dazzle nations. But memory can vanish in an instant, unless we fight to preserve it. And so the richest man in history was almost forgotten. But today, his story resurfaces, not as myth, but as history. A reminder of what Africa gave to the world, and a warning of how easily greatness can be silenced. When we think of wealth today, we measure it in numbers, billions of dollars, stock values, companies, and investments. But centuries ago, one man's fortune was so vast it shook entire nations. Mansa Musa was more than the richest man who ever lived. He was a builder, a patron of learning, a man of faith, and a symbol of Africa's forgotten greatness. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Rockefeller. These names dominate modern discussions of wealth. But none of them compare to Musa, whose fortune is estimated to be worth over $400 billion in today's value. And yet, while the names of modern billionaires are taught in every classroom, Mansa Musa's name remains almost forgotten. 1. History is not just about kings and battles. It is about memory, who we choose to remember, and who we allow to be forgotten. The story of Mansa Musa reminds us that Africa's history is not one of poverty, but of power, wealth, and brilliance. It is a story the world must not ignore again. This has been the untold story of Mansa Musa, the richest man in history. But his story is only one of many. There are countless forgotten tales of power, resistance, and humanity waiting to be uncovered. Mansa Musa's story is not just about gold, power, or empire. It's about how easily history can be rewritten and how voices can be silenced. If his name could almost vanish from the pages of history, how many other stories have we lost? How many heroes, thinkers, inventors, and kings remain hidden in the shadows of time, waiting to be remembered? That is why this channel exists, to bring the stories untold back into the light. Here, you will find the histories you were never taught in school, the voices that were silenced, the empires that were erased, and the people who shaped the world in ways we're only beginning to understand. If this story moved you, if it challenged what you thought you knew about history, then join us. Subscribe, share this video, and be part of a community that refuses to let history's greatest stories be forgotten. Your comments, your likes, and your support make it possible for us to keep uncovering the hidden past. Together, we can make sure Mansa Musa's story, and countless others, are not just remembered, but celebrated. This is the Stories Untold, and we are only just beginning.